PlayStation has some of the greatest exclusives available. Franchises like Uncharted, God of War, The Last of Us, Little Big Planet, even franchises such as Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, and Twisted Metal are still relevant thanks to nostalgia. While Sony has moved on from many of these classic titles, it's unfair to say that these games were failures, because clearly they were successful during their time. But what about those games that were supposed to be the next great PlayStation franchise but failed to do so? The games that had very few releases before calling it quits. Well, today we're going to take a look at the games that tried and failed to make it big. So sit back, relax, and if you enjoy content like this, and even content not like this, consider liking and subscribing. Now starting off, we have to talk about Knack. This was a PlayStation 4 launch title. It was meant to invoke the classic platforming days of PlayStation's past, while also being a technical showcase for the PS4's capabilities. This came at a time when Japan's studio was restructured to have more direction. But compared to their previous work, like Puppeteer, which was only released a couple months prior on the PlayStation 3, Knack just didn't scream Japan's studio. And depending on who you ask, Knack is either the best game they played, or it's the worst. Said to be a mix of Crash Bandicoot, Katamari Damacy, and God of War, Knack was a game that wanted to appease different types of gamers, but in doing so, didn't know exactly what it wanted to be. And like a lot of launch titles, Knack was successful enough to have a sequel. So in 2017, there was Knack 2. As someone who's played both games, I do have to say that the sequel improved upon everything from the first game. The graphics and character models were better, platforming was more enjoyable, and it wasn't as frustrating to play as the original. All these improvements from Knack to Knack 2 is a perfect example of why we sometimes need sequels. Developers deserve a chance to give us a game that is better in every way. But Knack 2 didn't sell nearly as much as the original, and with the closure of Japan's studio, Sony will likely never touch the series again. But while Knack was given a second chance, underwhelming reception of The Order 1886 made Sony turn their backs on what was planned to be a much larger franchise. With a cinematic style and gameplay inspired by Uncharted, The Order 1886 is set in London where the Knights of the Round Table fight against werewolves, vampires, and any other group threatening the safety of the world. Where the game fell short in its runtime and replayability, it made up for with incredible graphics and a presentation that still looks stunning today. Really, it was ahead of its time. An interesting story that had some surprising plot twists and simplistic gameplay. Anyone who's played the game knows it ends on a cliffhanger. Its developer, Ready at Dawn, was always vocal on wanting to make a sequel, but because Sony owns the IP, they were never able to. And we've since learned what was planned for the future of the series. This was the start of a trilogy, as The Order 1886 would have been followed up with The Order 1891, and then The Order 1899, with the pitch for the second game featuring bigger fights and a multiplayer component. And like The Order, Heavenly Sword was also meant to form a trilogy, but considering how the game ends, it would have been interesting to see how this continued. Heavenly Sword was one of those early PlayStation 3 titles that was very ambitious in what it was trying to do, clearly taking major inspiration from God of War, but at a time when that series was still on the PlayStation 2. And the game had so much going for it. Large open battlefields with hundreds of enemies, something I still don't really see in this generation of games. We also had destructible environments and cinematic QuickTime events. And the characters really made the game what it is. Noriko herself has such a memorable look. Then the weird and interesting supporting characters and villains just add to the game's charm. A sequel was in development, but not by original developer Ninja Theory. Instead, Sony had their own Cambridge studio developing the game. However, Sony didn't see Heavenly Sword being a commercially viable product, and they would end up canceling it. Oddly though, Heavenly Sword did get an animated movie in 2014, but it wasn't because the game was so popular. It was more of an experiment by Blockade Entertainment to show Sony that they could make a big budget looking film, and this led to the Ratchet & Clank movie. Now, if you own a PlayStation Vita, Gravity Rush was one of those must-have games for the handheld, and thankfully Sony was wise enough to remaster this game for the PlayStation 4 a few years later. This is truly one of the most unique games out there, and undeniably Japan's studio at its best. You have the ability to control gravity, meaning you'll be flying through the air, walking on walls, and doing anything else you normally couldn't do in a video game. And luckily for us, we got Gravity Rush 2 on the PlayStation 4. This meant new powers were added, graphics were pushed to perfection, and the world was over twice as big as the original. So much was stuffed into this game, and it was an experience I have never forgotten. A third game never happened, Japan's studio was closed, the creator of the game moved on, and outside of a planned movie, who really knows if Gravity Rush will make a comeback? The sequel wrapped up a lot of the story, but there was still that cliffhanger ending that will never see any sort of resolution. Back when Little Big Planet was released, Sony found new success in what they would call play, create, share. And while Little Big Planet would get plenty of sequels, Sony would expand this concept of content creation into other games like Modnation Racers. For years there have been Mario Kart clones, and typically they don't do much to innovate or change up the formula. But Modnation Racers was completely different. Players could not only race tracks made by the developers through a story mode, but they could create and share their own, create and share mods, and create and share karts. And the creation tools could be easy to use or complex depending on how detailed one wanted to get. Really, anything was possible, and the creativity some people had was off the charts. The game would get a follow-up on the PlayStation Vita called Modnation Racers Road Trip, which lacked a story mode but featured new courses on top of creation tools that could use the Vita's touchscreen. And in comparison to the original, Road Trip wasn't as well received. There would be a successor with Little Big Planet karting from the same developers. It has the same type of gameplay, but with Little Big Planet's creation tools and some new game modes. It's been said that this was originally going to be Modnation Racers 2, and that the developers weren't fans of having to switch to Little Big Planet karting. And while Little Big Planet spawned years of content creation, Sony eventually moved on. So what do you do when you have a character as iconic as Sackboy? Well, you spin him off into his own game called Sackboy: A Big Adventure. Like Nintendo's Mario, Sackboy is also pretty versatile in how the character can be used. In what's often described as PlayStation's version of Super Mario 3D World, Sackboy: A Big Adventure is a game that blends in elements of Little Big Planet's gameplay while transitioning it into a 3D platformer. And there's a lot to love about this game. It has co-op, it's challenging in some areas, there's a ton to unlock, and a lot of amazing surprises that caught me off guard. The problem for many, especially when it comes to longtime fans, is that this isn't Little Big Planet 4 and there's no creation mode. But to be fair, it's the reason why this isn't labeled as a Little Big Planet game. I don't know if people thought it looked childish or simply didn't care, but even as a PS5 launch title, I'm not sure it made much of a difference. And clearly Sony had plans to expand this spin-off series because there was a mobile follow-up called Ultimate Sackboy, which was more or less a Subway Surfers type of game. Now years later, Sony has had success with Astrobot. With that becoming as massive as it is, it may be the only mascot platformer Sony needs. And for many, Astrobot has replaced Sackboy. However, I do think there's room for both. And if you enjoyed Astrobot, you should play Sackboy: A Big Adventure. I think you might be surprised at just how good the game is. If you were a PlayStation 3 player back then, you would likely know about Fat Princess. In this twist on Capture the Flag, players pick from different classes to try and rescue their princess. Only each team needs to fatten their captured princess with cake, to make it difficult for the opposing team to take her back. It was so popular on the PlayStation 3 that Sony ported it to the PlayStation Portable with new additional content. But after this, the series would take a weird turn. The first was a mobile game called Fat Princess Piece of Cake, which was a Bejeweled-inspired puzzle game that also featured the ability to level up each class member. And the second would be Fat Princess Adventures on the PlayStation 4. Like the title suggests, this was a co-op adventure for up to 4 players. While it does have a pretty funny story, the game forced in unnecessary microtransactions, which helped make the game easier. And if you're playing this alone, you need this to level up faster. Otherwise, you're sort of forced to play with others. But what this game lacked was that twist on Capture the Flag. You know, the thing that made Fat Princess what it is. Why Sony took this series into a completely different direction so soon after its success, who knows? But it's pretty doubtful we will ever see a new game. Days Gone is a game that has broken many hearts, and that's because there hasn't been a sequel. Now the game isn't perfect, it launched with bugs and issues. I found the pacing of the story and how it was done to be a bit odd, but it might have one of the most beautiful and engaging open worlds thanks to the rich Oregon environment. The story behind this game not getting a sequel is one giant mess. From upper management at Bend Studio denying the pitch for a sequel, to Sony being strict on games achieving a certain Metacritic score. Then reports on Sony not wanting to have another game, like The Last of Us, set in the post-apocalypse. Something behind the scenes has prevented this story from continuing. So while plans for what could have been a co-op sequel were scrapped, this hasn't stopped Sony from remastering the game for the PlayStation 5 and developing a movie adaptation for some time in the future. Now I debated on whether or not to include Concord, but it was clear Sony was banking on this being the next big thing. Costing over $400 million to develop over the course of 8 years, this was the biggest flop in PlayStation history. When the game launched to mixed reviews and low sales, Sony gave out full refunds and shut the game down completely 2 weeks after launch. And its developer Firewalk Studios was closed almost 2 months later. People blasted the game on social media, the characters weren't appealing, and there was nothing new or revolutionary that wasn't seen in hero shooters years prior. In a live service space where more games end up dying than surviving, it's a tough market to find success. Asking $40 for a brand new IP for an online-only game is a lot to ask. Even with that $40 meaning no microtransactions, and future updates and unlockables being free. But clearly Sony thought higher of Concord because an entire episode was dedicated to it in the first season of Amazon's Secret Level series. Now would going free to play have changed Concord's outcome? Probably not. But if anything came from this, it shook up Sony's plans for its live service future. Not entirely backing away from the concept, but realizing they need to focus more on their strengths while being careful on the live service games they put out. And if anything would work well as a live service game, it would be PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. When this came out in 2012, so much was against it. Here we have a major competitor going up against Nintendo's Super Smash Bros., and immediately people were against it. In a day and age where collaborations are crazy in games like Fortnite, Call of Duty, and even Astrobot, PlayStation All-Stars didn't have that luxury. Many publishers at the time were against lending their character to the game, hence the somewhat mediocre roster and filler characters. Even further planned downloadable content was cut due to lackluster sales of the game. But there was another mobile follow-up exclusive to Europe in collaboration with Coca-Cola called PlayStation All-Stars Island. And as Astrobot has proven, people love PlayStation nostalgia, and Sony has more than enough first-party characters to keep players coming back. Plus, Sony owns Evo, and if their upcoming Marvel fighting game is any indication, they have more than enough reason to make a sequel. So what failed PlayStation franchise would you like to see make a comeback? Let us know down in the comments. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and ring that bell to be notified about future content. If you enjoyed this, check out this previous video on why Sony needs to up their game on these DualSense controllers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.